Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button so that more people can get exposed to organized money. Really appreciate it.
Organized money.
Hey, remember the price of eggs? Chuck Schumer keeps telling me that the price of eggs is a real problem. And can we maybe explain why that it's not just egg producers hate Donald Trump or something?
I mean, this is the second time in the last couple of years. I remember in 2023, people would say, they put out memes being like, instead of he went to Jared, he went to Kroger kind of thing,
Right,
right? Like
right.
got us eggs. And now it's the same thing, right? Back then I forget what was the reason, but this time it's
It's the same reason. I mean, if
avian
you if you
flu.
if you talk to people in the industry, I think it's more widespread now. But basically, that there is this outbreak of avian flu, and the way that we do things in this country is that when there's an outbreak like that in the chicken population, we just kill all the chickens who may be affected by that outbreak. And as a result, it's really hard to find egg laying hens at this point, and that drives the price up.
Yeah, there's a whole monopolization around eggs. There's a story there, but that's not what we're going to go into here because I think the avian flu that's going in and killing, these industrialized bird operations, just killing a million birds, it's is a little bit of a metaphor for what could happen with any other part of our food system because it reflects the consolidated nature of our food system. And it's not how it used to be. We used to have a much more distributed food system with smaller farms and whatnot.
Absolutely. So now, if you take a drive from LA to San Francisco, this is the only way us coastal liberals know anything about the food system. You take a drive from LA to San Francisco, the midway point is a city called Kalinga. And if you drive through Kalinga on the I-5, you'll see a million cows. I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. You'll see a million cows in a concentrated animal feeding operation that's right off the 5 freeway. And if you think about what would happen if there was mad cow disease or some other outbreak, that population would be completely wiped out with dire consequences for our food system. And it's the same with grains, corn, soybeans, wheat. All of these things are now produced in industrial quantities in one place and creating more opportunities for failure across the entire system.
We have a great guest to explain why things have gotten so brittle and aren't resilient and so consolidated. And it's a farmer. His name is Jeff Bender, and he is from North Carolina and has about 40 years in farming, doing all sorts of different types of farming. And yeah, he's going to give us an explanation of how the industry works, how you make money, how you lose money, the farm politics, the farm bill, just kind of the whole system, and explain why we got to this pretty dangerous point.
All right, Jeff Bender, Bender Farms, Norlina, North Carolina. Let's hear from him. It's organized money. Jeff Bender is the owner of Bender Farms in Norlina, North Carolina. Jeff, thank you for coming on Organized Money.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
Great. So tell us about your farm. How long your family been in business in North Carolina, and what do you produce today?
Well, it's a long story, so I'll try to keep it short and feel free to edit
Okay.
out what if you want. But my father, my father grew up on a farm about 8 miles from this. And he and his brother were farming together back in the mid 40s, and he found this farm and bought it in 1946.
Hmm.
And it was a worn out kind of cotton farm or cotton plantation, depending on how you look at it. It's just under 300 acres. And really he revitalized the farm. He was a really very good farmer. And I'm the oops baby of the family, the youngest of five. And so my dad was 46 when I was born, so I never knew him as a young man. Um, and when I kind of came along, he was kind of on the tail end of his farming career. But I fell in love with farming from from the very beginning. I just was fascinated by the things he did and working with animals and working with crops. And so I
What was the
attended,
first time you started farming? When was that?
well, I had my own little plots from the time I was probably 8 years old. He would let
Okay.
me have a little corner of the garden or some spot, and I'd raise, a 6 by 10 foot spot of corn or something, or
Okay.
I remember my biggest crop. I had two whole rows of flue-cured tobacco when I was about 10 years old. Maybe not quite that old, actually. That was one of Dad's crops. We're in the tobacco belt, such as it was. It's not much of a belt anymore.
Uh-huh.
But he was a very diversified farmer. Tobacco was the kind of cornerstone anchor economically, and that was for 8 acres.
Mm.
And the interesting thing on that
Wait,
is,
you were growing tobacco at 10 years old?
well, I had a couple ropes.
That's kind of amazing. Because
Well,
it's
I mean,
like
I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. Um, I was always afraid I might like it, and I had enough from my German background. I had enough
I,
stinginess not to want to get into something that was going to cost me a lot of money for the rest of my life.
I'm with you. I never did it either. And my grandmother smoked and she would get the points to get special gifts and stuff. So when I was 10 years old, I was getting like a Salem t-shirt that I would wear to school, but I wasn't
Yes.
growing it. You know,
Yeah.
that's a far cry.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, Dad,
But as you
nobody in my
say, the
family. I'm
tobacco
sorry. Go ahead.
was really prominent in that area at that time. Maybe
Oh,
it's
when
not
I
so
was a
much
kid,
now.
when I was a kid in Warren County, which is the county I live in, just like probably most of the counties from central and eastern North Carolina, at any point in location, if you were on farmland in the summertime, you'd see a tobacco field.
Hmm.
I mean, it was just very, very, and it was different because growing up, these were all small farms. My dad's biggest crop was 8 acres, but and it was mostly all local labor and family labor. It
Hmm.
was not at all unusual for the local school system to delay opening school in the fall because the tobacco harvest was a
Mm.
little later than normal. And, probably 50% of the high school kids and the middle or junior high school kids worked on the farm. So, they were going to be pulling tobacco, harvesting tobacco regardless. So it wasn't
Yeah.
any point in having schools.
I don't want to get into this too much yet,
Hmm.
but we're gonna talk about the politics and business of farming. But tobacco, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the last crop to have supply management, the New Deal program that kind of gave guaranteed prices. And
Yes,
I believe it ended with like 2005 or something like that, or
2005. That's exactly right. They had to buy out.
that.
Hmm.
But I'll give you
Yeah,
an example. I know this isn't probably the right time, so you can move it if you want to. But I've got all of Dad's farm records from the mid 40s to when he stopped farming in the basement of the house. I live in the house I grew up in. My wife and I bought it, but my father and my mother passed away. So let's just take an average year, 1964. I was 2 years old. Dad had 8 acres of tobacco. And in those days, you had to have the local USDA, they came out and measured the amount of crop you had. They were that
Hmm.
much of a stickler.
Hmm.
And he made 24,000 pounds of saleable tobacco, which is 3,000 pounds of the acre, which even today, how many years later this is, 60 years later, would be
Hmm.
considered to be a very good crop. So that's kind of testament to how good a farmer he was. And he sold that crop for almost $18,000 in 1964. I went one time and plugged in on one of these inflation calculators that you could find online.
Yeah.
What is money worth today? So you take that $18,000 from 1964 and plug it in. According to that calculator, it's worth about $180,000 today.
Yeah.
Now, I cannot imagine being able to gross $180,000 off any 8 acres of short of, it's probably not even that profitable now to grow pot anymore because it's become so widespread. I there, but it's testament to what the farm program really did. Warren County probably had 300 small farms, maybe more than that back in the 50s, that were farm units that made a living. I mean, my father paid for the
wait,
standard
let's
acre farm.
I want to get into this, but let's just get some basics because, this is a little bit, I mean, I grew up in a suburb in Miami. We had some like trees, mango trees and stuff like that. But this is basically like farming for city liberals, right? Who don't know anything about farming. So my impression of a farm, is, old MacDonald had a farm. Yeah, yeah. Like on that farm, there was some pigs, and you go down the line.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's how farms look anymore. Um, but what have you grown over the years? And then what are the basic different types of farms?
Okay, so I'll start back a little bit further. My father, of course, had tobacco, but he also had laying hens. He raised chickens and used to sell his eggs directly to stores and restaurants and so forth. Went
So
back
he
in the
was old
50s.
MacDonald,
He really
basically.
was. That's how farming was in those days. He had the chickens, he had geese at one
Yeah.
time, he had
Huh.
pigs, he had cattle. By the time I came along, he had pretty much narrowed it down to raising some field crops like corn and soybeans and wheat, and then tobacco, and then he had a beef cattle herd. I graduated from NC State in 1985 in agriculture. I had an animal science, a BS in animal science. And I didn't know what I was going to do coming home. In fact, when I was a senior, the ag economy was so bad, I interviewed with several companies and was offered a job if I said the name of the company, you'd recognize it immediately. Not the most well-respected company today. So maybe I'm glad I didn't take the job. But what
That
they
really
offered
doesn't
me
narrow it
then,
down at all.
Yeah, that could be
Boeing.
anybody.
well, let's say it begins with an M and ends with Santo.
Okay. So Boeing.
Yeah,
Right.
there you go. And what they offered me, well, technically they didn't offer me the job. They offered to fly me to St. Louis for the last round of interviews, and the placement officer said they only do that to people they're intended out for a job. But they were offering this snotty-nosed 22-year-old kid, me, like 30,000 a year and an expense account and a vehicle. I mean, 30,000 in 1985 would be 100,000 or more today after you adjusted for inflation. But anyway, so I didn't take the job because they said I could be placed anywhere in the continental U.S. and I didn't want to be that far from home. I ended up working for an ag consultant for about 6 months. And then I decided I needed to get the farming out of my system. I was going to go back and try it. I had a
Mhm.
degree, so I knew I could fall back on that if I needed to. And I've been plugging along ever since. So when I started farming, I was raising row crops. Row crops mean basic. When you hear somebody say the term row crops, they're talking about corn and soybeans primarily,
Right.
small grain like wheat or oats or barley. Cotton probably fits in the the term row crops. Probably not wheat because row crops literally means plant the crop in a row. But anyway, so I was raised in that. I built a small beef cattle herd. I raised some swine, finished some pigs on dirt and on pasture raised pigs. And I was going nowhere fast. And I got married. I uh, I was I was fortunate enough to con a city girl into marrying me and coming out to the country. I knew better than even try to date country girls because they would have told me where to go. They weren't about to stay on the farm.
Huh.
So, and I don't mean to, Lisa, my wife is we've been married for 37 years. It'll be 38 years or 30,
Congratulations.
38 years this August. And she's been a great partner. She's a high school English literature teacher, but she worked on the farm for the first 10 years we were married. But anyway, we weren't going anywhere fast. And I'd always been fascinated by the dairy business. I had a real interest in that. And I did my due diligence. I looked at 5 years of production history and 5 years of prices and production costs. And I was able to talk a lending institution into loaning me the money. And my parents deeded me part of the farm so that we could use it as collateral for the loan. And we got into the dairy business and spent, a pretty significant chunk of money that I'm still paying on today. That's how bad
Now,
the dairy industry got. When we got into
yeah.
it, North Carolina did away with their milk commission. It used to have a state milk commission that had people from the dairy production industry, farmers, that had retailers, that had consumers, and they would look at all the data and on a monthly basis set the price of milk, both for the consumer in the grocery store and the raw
Hmm.
product going in. And everybody had a chance to make a profit, and nobody had a chance to really I'm trying to think. I don't think you want me to use some of the language I would normally use, but so it was a truly government controlled. Well, in 1990, they were sued because the Interstate Commerce Clause said you couldn't restrict because there was so much milk coming in from out of state, and so they disbanded it. And I talked to a dairy economist who said, I don't think that's really going to be an issue everywhere else in the country when they've done away with state milk commissions. They went through a federal order. The price of milk stayed steady or actually increased. So I was full gun, full speed ahead. Um, so when we were building the dairy, milk was bringing $18 to $20 a hundredweight. And you sell milk by the poundage, so it's 100 pounds is the unit of sale. The first milk I sold was for $11. So you can see the drop there.
Yeah.
Not only did I not have a 5-year period that corresponded with the 5 years prior to getting into it, you couldn't take 5 individual years out of the 17 years I milked cows and put together and have as good a year as those 5. So we struggled along and, barely kept our nose above water. I always tell people I love dairy farming. I hate the dairy business.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I think when people think about milk and dairy, they think about Wisconsin, they think about Vermont, they don't think about the South as a locator for that. And as you're saying, when those price supports were pulled up, the ability for you to survive in North Carolina was really difficult. But is this regionalization part of the trends of changes in American farming that you've seen over the years?
Well, I think so. I think that even so, with a few exceptions, most of the states in the Southeast, or even really the Mid-South, the Southwest even, the dairy industries were there to produce fluid milk, what you buy in a gallon jug at the grocery store.
Right.
The upper Midwest typically was the place that they manufactured cheese, and so it's a lot of manufacturing milk. And in fact, the dairy economist out of NC State that told me that he didn't think it was going to be much difference one time years later said the thing he didn't realize was that everywhere else in the country that had done away with the state and went to a federal order were places where they were manufacturing milk, making cheese and so forth. And so it was a different industry. But still, when I started building the dairy in the 1990s, there were about 2,000 dairies operating in North Carolina. When we sold the herd in 2007, they were down to 300, and now it's just over 120. So in North Carolina, if you buy a gallon of milk, probably 60% of that milk is going to have traveled over 700 to 1,000 miles to get to North Carolina. So in that situation, what has happened is, like everything else in farming, it's been get big or get out. North Carolina has some places, but typically we're not really the kind of place that is conducive to a 5 or 10,000 cow dairy herd.
So you've grown all sorts of different types of crops and raised different animals and done dairy farming. So you have a pretty broad experience, and then you almost got a job for paid too much from from Boeing, right? Which does seeds and chemicals. Okay.
Yes.
So if I understand it right. Now, one of the things that is kind of weird. So for me, I grew up I live in, outside of DC, and there's a sort of total disconnect between consumers and farming, right? At this point, it's like way more extreme than I think we've ever seen in American history, right? Where you just most people have no experience with farm animals or growing crops or anything like that. And they maybe don't even know anyone who has such experience. And the people who do have experience, they don't necessarily have relationship with people like me, right? There's just like this huge, huge gap. And it's a big cultural gap. It's a big sort of experiential gap. So, is that new? Is that different? Like in the 80s, was that the case, this kind of alienation from the food system, this huge split, or was that something that has always been there? Because
No,
I
I
think
don't
that's
think
a
it's always been there by any means because it is every generation has gotten further away from the land. That's a natural progression. I mean, back in the colonial era, I guess probably 50% or the majority of the population, because you got a
Yeah.
small population, they basically fed themselves and so forth. So when I was a kid, I think you would go to Washington or New York, and a lot of people still had some relationship. Maybe they grew up on a farm and moved to the city. Maybe they had an uncle. Maybe they had a grandfather. So there was some connection there still. But the other part of it is that, right now you could fit all the farmers in the country that produce 80% of the food and fiber in a handful of football stadiums. I mean, we're
Yeah.
down to probably less than 1 million people that actually grow. I mean, there are several, I think they say I forget what the percentage of the population is now, but like in so many industries, you've got the top 20% produce 80% of the product. So if you take that top 20% of growers left, you know, 500,000 farmers for a country of 370, 80 million people.
And
And it,
I think some, Jeff, I think some people would look at that and say, well, yeah, that means that farmers are really much more productive now than they were then, and it's good that people can go on to other pursuits rather than having to do subsistence farming for themselves. But I'm wondering what you think we might lose in that exchange
well,
when it is such a small percentage of the population.
Well, it's two things. I don't think the individual farmer as an individual has necessarily any more productive today. The difference is he has the tool. I guess technically you could say he's more productive, but it's
Because he has
only
assistance
because,
from
right, he's got
technology. Yeah.
this huge amount of technology. And the problem with that, in my opinion, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who would disagree, but I've been farming for 40 years, and every year is different. Every year I learn something new.
Hmm.
And we live in a society now where everybody thinks they get all their information from this,
Yeah.
or, and I will say that I don't think you could go, and I'm a loyal NC State alum, but you can't go to NC State or any land grant university. I mean, Matt, if you're talking about you have no experience, you couldn't go and take the ag courses and graduate and go out and successfully manage a farming operation. It's an apprenticeship. In my opinion, it's a lifelong apprenticeship. And
Mm.
so, you know, it's something that is the agricultural industry is one of those industries. There's only a handful of industries in the country or world that are indispensable. You know, if we didn't produce any cars for a year, it would be a lot of hardship, but probably nobody's going to die.
Right.
Food, water, clean air, but food being probably the most prominent of those because you could probably find water, even if it's dirty, it's okay. But food, I don't know how long a human being can live, but anyway, it just to me innately, it doesn't make any sense that we're having fewer and fewer people learning all the skills to farm as we have more and more people in the population. That's
Right.
just counterintuitive to me. And
You're
only
saying there's a
because,
resiliency. You're saying it's a resiliency angle.
well, it's the way I farm today is entirely different than the way I farmed when I started. I'm more
Hmm.
into regenerative ag now and doing, no tillage and so forth. We were doing all of that in the late 80s. So things change, and it's a certain extent you have to. I'm sorry.
Hmm.
I realize that my phone is on. Let me cut the ringer off on that. My
Yeah, I
apologies.
heard that. That's fine.
Okay.
You
Well,
can
let
just
me let me
start.
Um,
just
You can
ask you.
just.
So
Okay, go ahead.
so you said, and you've talked about this on other podcasts. And actually, we connected because I wrote about some consolidation and the Farm Bill.
right.
Why, like, go big or get out, right? That's the sort of in all aspects of agriculture. Why? What's driven that?
Profit margins. Your profit per unit. So again, going back to my dad's farm records, in 1957, he sold corn for $1.25 a bushel. Today it's $4. So that's, somewhere between three times more. All the input costs are up 10, 15, 20%. So these farmers now that are farming 1,000 acres, 5,000, 10,000, they're not making any better of a living. They're not making any more money really. and say my father did, or other farmers that might have been farming a few hundred or 500 acres years ago. The problem,
So
and
the
you're asking
margins,
it,
so what you're saying is the margins are thinner, so they have to do it
oh,
across a.
absolutely.
So, but why? I mean, is that is that because the middlemen are taking more, or is that? I mean, I remember as a kid when we would buy food in the U.S., it was cheap, and you if you go to Europe, right, it would be expensive. And today, it's the opposite, right? Today, food is expensive in the U.S. and it's cheaper all over the world. Like when you just go to the supermarket.
Mhm.
So the profit margins are lower for the farmer, but the food is more expensive for the consumer. Who's making the money? Like, what's going on?
Right.
John Deere. Well, I mean, it does kind of feed into your whole. I mean, reading your columns and so forth. Monopolies are a focus of y'all's attention. When I started farming, there were within about a less than a half an hour drive, there were 7 different farm equipment dealerships. There were 5 different, I call them paint colors, different brands farm equipment. Today, there's one. When I started farming, there were half a dozen different dealers of farm input supplies, fertilizer, seed, chemicals. Now there's one. When I started, there were markets all over the place. There were stock markets. There were just things. That so essentially today, and this is the biggest thing that is threatening agriculture. There's no competition for my dollar when I'm putting in a crop. When I'm going to spend money to buy inputs, there's little or no competition for that. So they can charge
Mhm.
whatever they want.
Yeah.
And when a farmer has something to sell, there's very little competition. We have had so many consolidation and mergers on all these major groups that you don't have that ability to have capitalism or the free market actually work. I mean, I'm no economist, I never really studied it, but it seems to me that capitalism only works with competition. If you don't have competition, then you've got an economic almost dictatorship, certainly
Yeah.
they can do what they want. And that's the situation with there's lots of farm equipment that is ridiculously expensive. And it's way more than the average grower needs. But a lot of especially younger farmers, it's like shiny paint is the crack cocaine of a young farmer these days. And
Well, let me talk about you have described then consolidation on the input side. You're talking about farm equipment and maybe we can talk about seeds and things like that. And there's also this consolidation on the farm side. And it's multivariate. It's not just the size of farms, but also the types of crops that are being produced. I mean, you said that your dad primarily, made a lot of his money from tobacco, but farmed a lot of different things at once, and you did as well. And now it seems like there's a monoculture out there
Mhm.
where if you're a farmer, you're a corn farmer or you're a soybean
Well,
farmer.
that's something else that distorts the market because you take the
Yeah.
average, say, farm in the 1950s or 60s, they grew multiple crops. They had livestock in addition. So you had a farm that had corn, soybeans. He raised alfalfa. He may have had raised oats. If he looked in the spring and let's say the price of soybeans was really low, he could say, "I'm not going to plant any this year." My father did that plenty of times.
Right.
And he was also, if you made corn, he would take it and feed it to his own livestock and add value to it. That's all gone now. Well, it's not all gone. I mean, I can talk about what we're doing now. That's a little bit of a kind of a comeback of that, but it basically in big commercial agriculture, that's gone. When
Yeah.
you, as Matt said, or you said, a corn farmer is a corn farmer. He's going to
Yeah.
plant corn where corn is $3 a bushel or $30 a bushel, $3 a bushel or $8 a bushel.
Right.
He doesn't have a choice. He's got, several $1 million worth of equipment. There's no option to say, well, the price really sucks this year. I can't see I'm going to make a profit. I'm
Yeah.
not going to plant it.
And
You just can't do that.
I've heard you talk about how that not only is a problem for the farmer because they don't have a safety valve, they don't have another option, but it's also a problem for the food system in some way because if there's, it's a problem for pest control and it's a problem for those kinds of things. You talk about how the system is more vulnerable because of the consolidation and focus on single commodity crops.
So there are a couple things. I'm sure you're aware of the whole bird flu epidemic now national.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you
And
about eggs.
yeah, I mean, eggs are expensive now, not because of Bill Clinton. I mean, Joe Biden. They're expensive because they've got whole flocks dying and continue
Surely
to
not
die.
because of Bill Clinton.
Well, no,
I
I'm
confuse
sorry.
Clinton and
Actually,
Biden
it
a
would
lot
be, it'd
too.
be, it'd be
Clinton's
kind of
the
funny
young
if you were
one.
like, eggs
Clinton's
are
the younger
expensive
one.
because of Bill Clinton.
But
That guy, he's
so
eating
what
all
we've
the
got,
eggs.
when my dad raised chickens, he was a big chicken farmer here, and he had 1,000 laying hens.
Mm,
Now you've got them where they're piling millions of hens on top of each other. They're doing the same thing in the pork industry. They're
right.
almost so much of your pork is integrated, and so if you have a disease outbreak, guess what? You're not going to kill the 1,000 birds in my dad's flock. You're going to kill a million.
Right.
And this was happening years ago when I first started in the feed business. I had a customer who was an avian veterinarian. She was with USDA, and she raised her own heirloom turkeys. A nice little side business. She was buying non-GMO grain from me,
Hmm.
and she would talk about having to go to chicken farms, particularly in the Midwest, where they had an outbreak. And I guess this was here 10 years ago. It's just, blown up. And they'd have to go in there and they would foam the whole house. If they had, they were losing birds and they
Hmm.
had to go ahead and try to contain it. And they would foam the whole house and they literally had a million dead birds to go in and clean out.
Yeah.
Not one of her favorite things to do as a
No.
veterinarian.
And
So,
that's like a conscious choice. That's a decision, a policy decision that we've made, is that if there's an outbreak, we're going to kill all of the birds that are in any way connected to that. We don't try to vaccinate birds. We don't try to
I
do
don't
any
I
of that
don't
kind
know
of
enough
stuff.
to say. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know enough to
But
say
the
on
but the
that. I
point is that
I've heard that like in Mexico, there's a vaccination program. They haven't had to kill a bunch of birds when there's a situation like this. But as you say, when they're all sitting on top of one another, there's nothing you can do. You
No.
have to cut it off at the source if you want to ensure your suppliers that you're going to be giving them a product that's not sick.
it's a
Well,
little
I
bit.
mean, go ahead,
It
Matt.
actually sounds a little bit like a kind of like a consolidated banking system, right? Because if you have a bank that is small and goes out of business, it doesn't really matter that much. But if you have a big bank, it does matter. So killing whatever, 10,000 birds is very different than killing a million birds, right? If there's an outbreak. And so if you have a lot of farms that have 10,000 birds versus just a few farms that have a million birds, I'm totally making this up, by the way. You could literally say anything and I would believe you because I have no idea what I'm talking about. This is total
No,
thought
but I think you're
experiment.
exactly right, and that's the problem we have. When I was in the dairy business, it was back, uh, right after 9/11, and there was a lot of biosecurity things going on. I mean, we were having meetings and talking about locking up your dairy barn at night because they were afraid of some terrorists coming in and contaminating the milk, which was pretty ridiculous. But I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It's called foot and mouth disease. It's a
Yeah.
virus that affects cows, and they cause sores on their feet and their mouths, and they just go off feed. If the terrorists had any good sense, they could have taken a vial the size of a medicine bottle and gone to there are any number of roads in California that have a million dairy cows. They could have gone down
I've
there and
been by
spread
them.
that disease and wiped out, caused a huge economic problem in this country. Um, I think one thing and I'm sure that people would disagree with me, but I think if you really pin them down, they'd have to admit our food supply is not nearly as secure as people think it is. We've lived in a country that has had abundance. Nobody in this country has gone hungry in my lifetime for a lack of food availability.
Hmm.
Economics are a different thing, but there's been food. But we are one, because it's not just in the livestock. If you go through, say, the Midwest, you'll have counties that have a million acres of corn. And then, when I grew up around here, there were a lot of farmers raising corn. Now nobody is because we can't produce it as efficiently, so it's gone by the wayside. But we're putting the crops, we're packing them in, we're pushing them for the highest level of production. And we are one crop disease, one fungus away that wipes out a corn crop or a soybean crop from literally famine in this country. Now that may be an extreme, and most people would say this, but there are diseases that come in, a mutated disease. We saw it with that could come in, and we don't have any varieties that are resistant to it, and we don't know how to treat it. And the problem is that we have this this wrong belief that we just have this abundant supply of food when corn and soybeans literally feed the country because that feeds all the livestock industry.
Right.
We don't have this isn't we don't have the biblical Egyptian when they've got 7 years worth of food in storage. We
Right.
have maybe a month or two of a supply of corn and soybeans that have to that go that after the harvest. In other words, if we miss a harvest, we're not going to have that.
Yeah.
It's no multi-year. There was a time prior to Reagan in which there was a much larger supply of grain and cheese and all. Everybody's heard the jokes about the caves full of cheese back in the 80s that they got rid of, and I understand why that happened, but they have to be aware that again, you get a disease that comes in here, and we're not only packing stuff on top of it, we're trying to push these crops to make these exceedingly high yields.
Right.
Wait,
And a
so
crop
wait,
is just like an animal.
wait a second. So you're saying that, okay, so there's been this consolidation trend. The middlemen gain more power. Then you have the monoculture crops. But then was the government building these storehouses of grain and cheese and whatnot? Was that what was
Back the farm program, the remnants of the New Deal farm programs back in the 70s did have, elevators full of grain that the government owned.
so it was a
And
government?
when
Okay,
I
so it
was
was government.
Yeah, when I started farming, when Reagan, because it coincided kind of with the Reagan administration when I started doing something. I think then Bush came and they had this thing that was called the PIC program, the payment in kind. And so this was still when they were making significant payments to farmers. And what they did was rather than make a payment to you, they gave you grain. They gave you a certificate that said you now own 1,000 bushels or 5,000 bushels or something of grain at a particular elevator. Now nobody went and got it. They just turned around and sold that certificate, and that elevator could go ahead and put it on the market instead of keeping it. And so they basically liquidated all of that store grain and I don't know the numbers. You'd have to talk to somebody who has more data on that.
That's
But
it.
I know I got a number of
Well,
PIC certificates at the time.
so let's get to politics now, because one of the things that's interesting about, we've corresponded a little bit is you were involved in the Farm Bureau, right?
Yes,
And you've been
I was
involved
county
in,
president for 20 years, and I've been a little bit involved in American Farm Bureau, but much more involved with North Carolina Farm Bureau.
so one of the things that I think is a little bit opaque to people who live in cities is the politics of farmers, right? And I've, worked on monopoly issues, and there are always people around farmers who care about consolidation, but it feels a little bit like farmers don't think about the problem of monopoly. They think about the problem of how do I, sell more, grow more crops and sell them? How do I grow more? How do I improve my cattle and sell that? And they kind of see, the middlemen, the Monsantos and the JBSs and as kind of like allies when they're actually being kind of like preyed on by these guys. And so tell us a little bit about your involvement in farm politics, the Farm Bureau. What is it? And also, like, how do farmers generally think about politics and the politics of their industry?
Okay, so are you familiar with a politician from North Carolina named Jeff Jackson? Have you heard of him?
He's currently the attorney
Attorney
general
General in
right
North
now.
Carolina,
Yeah,
right?
he
And he
was
was a congressman from a
he was a
district,
congressman for one term. Yeah.
right? Well, prior to becoming a congressman, he was running for Senate in North Carolina, and he went around and went to every county and had a sit down, a talk. He came to Warren County, and I just happened to be going by. It was at the rec center, and I decided I'd pull in. And as it turns out, they had changed the location last second, and there was literally nobody there. So I walk up, and Jeff is sitting at a picnic table, and I sat down and talked to him for about an hour.
Uh-huh.
Super good guy. I mean, I see his TikTok videos. I keep up with him. I hope
Yeah.
he runs for Senate and gets that jackass Tillis out. I hope that I could see him being president one day because he actually cares about his constituents. You can tell him by talking to him. Well, anyway, I've got a story about that. I don't need to get into it. But
All
anyway,
right.
So sitting down talking to him, we were just talking about just like we're talking here, and it surprised me. So farming is an industry that has no direct ability to pass along price increases. So if minimum wage went up, and I'm fully supportive of that, and I have to suddenly, let's just say for argument's sake, I have to double what I pay employees. I have no ability to recoup that in any way because I don't set the price of what I sell.
Mm.
Farming, there are other industries that have, this is something unique about farming, and this isn't looking for the sympathy, it's just explaining the situation.
Yeah.
Farmers have very to no control over how much they spend to put a crop in. That's all dictated to them, how much the price of fertilizer is, the price of seed, et cetera. And they have very little ability to say the price. I mean, good, really sharp growers can use the markets and they can lock in prices and so forth, but still, the prices are what the markets say it is at a range. Farming also has that third wheel or third leg, which is Mother Nature, which very few other industries then have to contend with as well, which is, this year in my farm here, we had two periods of 2 months with zero rainfall. We went from the middle of May to the middle of July without a drop of rain, and the same thing through the early September to early November. Now, the second one wasn't as devastating as the first. So, from a farmer's perspective, Matt, you were talking about the farmer primarily is just trying to get from year to year. He doesn't have the opportunity, at least the family farms, the smaller farming operations. You're just trying to cash flow, pay your bills, and get from year to year. The bigger picture isn't what happens. And so, as a farmer, I went back when I was in the dairy business. I was very active in dairy association as well as with the Farm Bureau. And I remember one time going to a meeting in Raleigh, which is the state capital, and it was at the North Carolina Farm Bureau offices, but the people from the Division of Environmental Resources, basically the environmental folks out of the state government were there. And I looked around the room, and there were about a dozen people at this meeting. We were talking about air quality. And I realized I was the only one in that room that wasn't being paid to be there.
Hmm.
Everybody else was was part of their own job. Me, it was a waste of time. When, I support environmental initiatives, I understand it, but so often they can be an additional economic burden that a farmer cannot recoup. He cannot pass that along. It's a dead expense. And farmers look at that and so they resent people who come in. You can buy a farm, you can operate it, play by all the rules, and suddenly somebody comes and says, "Oh, we've changed the rules."
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of got when I built the dairy, I had a
Right,
waste
but they don't
management
see
system in
that
place.
they don't see that Monsanto merges with Bayer or rolls up a whole bunch of seed companies. They don't necessarily perceive that as changing the rules, or maybe they do. I don't know.
They do,
But
they realize that, but I mean, I guess they're kind of used to not being able to do shit. I'm sorry, not being able to do anything
Don't
about
worry,
it.
don't worry about it. We're
Figuring it out.
PG-13 at best.
Okay.
But I think,
It's
but I think it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, you're saying that you're describing this squeeze that small farmers have. They're at the mercy of a lot of other
all
forces.
farmers really. I
Yeah,
mean, it's
any farmer at the mercy of a bunch of different forces. But there was a time, sort of, in what is known as the New Deal Farm Bill,
mhm,
when government did protect farmers and particularly protect small farmers through guaranteed prices, supply management, things like that. How is government policy? How did it walk off that field and put farmers in the position you're talking about now, where they don't have a friend in government to help protect them?
well, let's go back to the New Deal and the origins of the farm program. And I've read some things that have alluded to it. And this is the way I view it. The New Deal did not put the farm program in place just to help the farmer.
Right.
They were protecting the food supply. Because if you think about the 20s and 30s, and we wouldn't have communism and the Russian Revolution had they fed their people a little bit better. People tend to get upset when they can't eat. there are lots of revolutions that are driven by that really, and it's not just being poor, it's being hungry.
Yeah.
And so I really believe that the Roosevelt administration looked at it and said, it's one way to pacify people. And pacify isn't a good word because it seems like you're doing it on purpose, but you try to avoid civil unrest. People who are hungry tend to be unhappy.
Yeah.
And so it's my belief that the whole farm program began with an idea to stabilize the food supply. And by helping the farmers to be able to be, reasonably profitable, that stabilized because there were farmers going out of business, the Dust Bowl, all the stories about the Dust Bowl and small farmers being run out and the whole grapes of wrath thing, people moving. And that was all around the country. My dad used to talk about when his father was farming back in the 20s, and you'd have one year there was a boom year and a year there was a bust.
Yeah.
And so, to kind of bring it back around to talk about tobacco, which was one of the most highly regulated of all the farm commodities. Back in the 20s, one year, and this is before this happened, apparently tobacco got short and it got really high. And his father built a tobacco barn, which is a specialized barn for curing tobacco. And tried to plant tobacco this year. Well, the next year, it just boom fell off to nothing. It was a one-time crop for them. Once they put in the farm bill, it stabilized. It stopped the overproduction. Now, a good example of this is if I look back at my farming career, I could probably say there aren't very many smart things I've ever done. But I've but about
Why are we
years,
interviewing this guy, Dave?
I don't know, man.
I've got a lot of experience.
This is kind of weird.
I was
What are
told
we
I should
doing?
run a nonprofit because I'm very well versed in how to do that. About 6 years ago, if you remember, when hemp was suddenly a big deal, and the hemp for the CBD oil, not the fiber hemp,
Right.
but they were pushing it, and I was offered a contract to grow hemp,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like you can grow $60,000 an acre. It's going to cost you $20,000 or $30,000 an acre to produce it, and you're going to net $30,000 or $40,000.
Sounds
And I
good.
thought, wow. And then I remembered my father, who said, "If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is." And of course, I turned it down, and because I didn't have $100,000 just to throw at it to begin with, and I knew I damn sure couldn't afford to lose that. Later that summer, I read an article on I think it was Yahoo News, that had estimated that there was 8 times more hemp grown that year than they could possibly ever use the products off of it. And that's what happens when you have a completely unregulated system.
Right.
And I know several neighboring farms that grew it and never sold the product. They ended up taking it out and spreading it on the land and plowing it in. That would have been the situation, and it's kind of the situation with tobacco now. Now, I am not a proponent of tobacco production, but let's say
You
back in
were
the
when
day,
you were 10.
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Just as a pre-adolescent.
I'm
That's
just
right.
saying.
But I mean, back in the 50s, if you ever watch Turner Classic Movies, you watch a movie from the 40s or 50s, and everybody smokes like a chimney. I mean, it was just boom,
But
boom. Everybody smoked.
sorry, let me get to some. There is an element here because we're talking about consolidation. We've covered farm. I want to actually I want to lead us to a slightly different topic, which is maybe more optimistic. And that is, there also seems to be a cultural renaissance of people who want to buy from farmers markets. And there are restaurants that want to do farm to table. And there is a sort of shift. It's not reflected in the policies. And we're probably not going to have time to get into the farm bill too much, but there does seem to be a sort of a desire, like the Make America Healthy Again stuff. Like there is a sort of recognition that something is very wrong with our food system. And there are attempts as eaters. I know we try to eat healthy, right? We try to go to farmers markets and stuff like that. Like, what have you seen from the farmer perspective, particularly from a small farm that has, a diversity of products coming out of your farm? Like, what do you see from that? And when did that start?
Well, Matt, actually, that whole phenomenon is what has kept me in business. And in fact, right now, my farming operation is probably the most profitable it's ever been because in 2017 we put in a feed mill and we started manufacturing livestock and poultry feeds. At the beginning, we used all of our own grain that we grew and we made these feeds, and we did it in conjunction with one retail outlet in North Carolina that sells all of our feed. So we produce a non-GMO whole grain livestock feed for chickens, turkeys, pigs, cows, goats, sheep, all kinds of different species.
And you're using your own seeds, right? You're not using like,
Well, we started out that way, but the business has grown to the point that I'm buying probably 60 to 70% of the grain we use now.
I see.
I wasn't interested in expanding my farming operation to try to meet that need. So I found other
But it's all
growers
non-GMO
it's
and
all
it's all
non-GMO.
okay.
And so there's still a handful of people, but back to what Matt was saying, I couldn't have done this 20 years ago. What I'm doing now is almost nobody, and we're producing almost 1,000 tons of feed a year now, which I mean,
Hmm.
Purina does that before they take a coffee break in the morning. So, we're just
But for you, it's big.
we're a fly speck on the wall compared to that. But I don't have a single, well, I have one customer, and that's the store that retails it. But anybody that buys our feed, I consider to be our customer. I don't think I have a single customer who is what you would call a traditional conventional farmer. And in
Hmm.
fact, most of them never grew up on a farm. Most of them would be like either one of you who decided to do exactly, Matt, what you were talking about. And we have two types of people. We've got the ones that are growing things for themselves. They have a backyard chicken flock for eggs. They have room enough to raise a steer that they take and get processed, or a pig, or raw milk is a really big thing. We've got a half a dozen people that have a couple of milk cows and they raise and they sell raw milk as pet food. But anyway, that's another whole story. The
Yeah.
second kind of producer is the people that are selling to folks like you're talking about, Matt, that are interested in farming. So we have a number of people that they're small by any commercial scale, but they sell a lot of stuff. They've got their own, maybe they're selling online, maybe they go to farmers markets, maybe they have a store. And we are fortunate in my situation to live with pretty easy access to the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill triangle area. So you have 1 million plus people that are reasonably well educated and pretty affluent. And they're willing to pay more for a product that they know they can look the person in the eye that produced it. And one of the things about our feeds is that is the traceability. I can tell
Hmm.
them exactly who grew the grain that went into that feed. And people appreciate that. They really do. I think people are starting to understand that they don't trust corporate America, and they see the tentacles that corporate America has put around their food supply. I think, Matt, in the email, you and I were talking about it, in that you could take, and I think you had a column that actually, you already did one, or a podcast that talked about this really small handful of CEOs that actually control the food supply in this country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if they wanted to, we'd be eating gruel 5 years. That was their, I mean, literally, they could do what they want to there. The other thing that comes into play, and people don't appreciate this, if you've only ever eaten vegetables out of a grocery store, you've never really tasted particularly good vegetables. I mean, I'm not a big tomato fan, but people that love tomatoes say you can't buy a tomato in a grocery store that's any good. When
They
I raised
bounce.
cantaloupes,
They bounce.
hmm?
They don't splatter.
But the reason is because modern agriculture doesn't care about local production. And I used to grow, I was in the produce business. I raised as much as 40 acres of various produce vegetable crops back in the teens at a while when I was kind of getting out of the tobacco business, but before I got into the feed business. And if you look at a seed catalog to decide what you're going to plant, you've got 20 different varieties of, say, sweet corn. Well, sweet corn is not sweet corn. Is not. I mean, there are definite differences. And the same way, cantaloupe is a better example. If you love cantaloupes, flavor and sugar content are inversely proportional to shelf life.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
sweeter the melon, the shorter. So if you're planning on raising something in the Imperial Valley of California and selling it in New York City, shelf life's kind of important.
Yeah, it's going to be a
So
problem.
yeah,
Well,
so
look, I
some
mean,
attributes of modern agriculture for things like vegetables have nothing to do with qualities that you and I would say.
yeah,
It's shelf
I,
life, it's shippability, and so forth. So if you're getting all your vegetables from South Florida or the Gulf Coast or the Southwest, you're not buying anything. I mean, there was a time which You
Yeah.
had strawberries in North Carolina during April and May when it was strawberry season. Now people think they should be able to get fresh strawberries year round.
Right.
Now they may not be worth the crap, but they can get them out of California. And
Well,
some,
yeah, and I'm in California, and I'm fortunate enough that we have farmers markets year round that they're somewhat seasonal, but they have a lot of crops year round because we
yeah.
have a favorable climate for that. And that's great. And I can do that. And frankly, I can afford that. But I've heard you talk before about sort of the relation between this and inequality. You're talking about sort of a wormhole that affluent people can find a way to value quality in their food intake, but so many people struggle to make ends meet that they base their food dollar on price, and that sort of plays into the agribusiness kind of machine-like system that you're talking about. And it just seems like that serves the purposes of agribusiness, and it's going to be hard to get out of that unless we have a real revolution in making sure that people have living wages and things, right?
Well, I mean, let's go back to one of my people that I'm not a big fan of John Deere. And everybody knows what John Deere is because they make a world of lawnmowers and so forth. And, but there was a time that John Deere built equipment that you could truly say was built to last, to be tough, and so forth. They had a corporate philosophy of trying to produce something of value to the farm for the farmer. Well, if you look at them now, how many thousands of people have they laid off in the Midwest factories? I mean, I don't have the data right in front of me, but they laid off a lot of people. It's not because they're losing money. It's because they're not making as much as they did last year. They made $40 billion, I think, last year. They're not going to make that much this year. So rather than bite the bullet and say, we're not going to make as much, they're laying people off. And most of these people are in, these factories are not in the middle of New York City where there are these are places. It's unfortunate where, you get laid off, you don't have many other options to go do it. It's an example of the corporate mentality now is we don't give a damn about anything except the bottom line.
Yeah.
And that's, in my opinion, it's the same thing you're talking about as monopolies. They wouldn't be able to do that so much if there were some competition out there for them. But
Right. They don't have to care about quality
yeah,
because
Well, I mean, they actually invest in making their stuff worse in terms of the right. There's a whole right to repair element of it too.
yes, I
They make about
understand.
with
$6
John
billion
Deere,
dollars.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so we're gonna have to kind of end this relatively soon because we could go on forever.
I've
It's
got all day,
fascinating.
but anyway.
But here, I want to get to, the Farm Bill because I think the Farm Bill was like 28, last one was 2017, 2018. And they're supposed to do them every 5 years, but they've been delaying them a couple times. So they're going to get to the Farm Bill this year. And the Farm Bill is this big thing that structures the food system in America. What is the Farm Bill? So I guess I've just said it, but from your perspective, what is it? And then, how does what kind of farming does it encourage, and how could we change it to reflect maybe a more resilient, localized farming system? So it's a big kind of mesh of questions, but there we go.
Well, in my part of the world, I think most farmers would say the Farm Bill has very little impact on them. When you look at the Farm Bill and it's got X number of dollars, I think about less than 20% of that actually goes in payments to farmers because all of your food programs, the SNAP program, all of that is under the Farm Bill because it's actually the Food Security Act. Farm Bill is a kind of a misnomer. It's a term. It may have started out that way, but now it's about food. And so food security, food availability is a big part of the Farm Bill. In terms of how it impacts farmers, the only appreciable payments that are made directly to farmers on basis on commodity are basically for the four main crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton. So if you're looking for any kind of residual safety net, and the payments that they make are below the ability profitability. I mean, it's kind of like, you need $100, they're going to give you 25. It's better than nothing, but it's not going to make you whole. So the farm bill, the idea of the farm bill actually props up agriculture is false. They passed that whole bill back in December, and a big portion of that was this disaster payments that they're trying to make to growers. Well, my it's $30 an acre on soybeans. Well, soybeans you would typically gross $600 an acre. So $30 as a percentage is pretty small. And when the prices have dropped by probably 30-40%, it's I'm not going to turn it down. If they write me the check, that'd be great. But it's a very, very small. I don't think there are many people. Now, I can't speak to the Midwest where they have bigger bases, they have bigger yield records. I mean, historical yield records. But what I think it does is it kind of locks a lot of growers into growing those crops. They
Yeah.
don't have, and a big part of it also comes into play that, and I know this from my experience, a lot of what you do depends on where you get your financing from. The financiers are looking for crops that have crop insurance availability. And really, crop insurance, which is highly subsidized by the federal government, primarily just the corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton. Now they
So it's catch
have a
22, you're
yeah,
saying,
so it's
like,
catch 22. You really
yeah.
can't, and you can't get the money to go do something else. I mean, when we put in the dairy farm, which is unusual for North Carolina, we went through the mill trying to get financing for it. Of course, now I wish they turned us down, but that's another whole story. But I don't know. Now there are significant payments to farmers to the farm bill that are more geared towards like conservation payments. They pay you for doing certain practices. The
Right.
conservation reserve program was to take erodible land out of production. They basically paid you land rent for it to put it in trees or put it in grass and leave it like that. And so you can make an argument either way about whether that's beneficial or not. But
So,
so
so
they
I
are
think,
payments to farmers, but
yeah. So I think what you're saying is that we need to support the whole plate rather than
sure.
just the part of the plate with that it survives on corn and soybeans. But I mean, maybe to wrap up here, what do you think we can do as a country to improve the situation for family farmers? And as a corollary to that, sort of why should we? Like, why in your view, is independent farming so important for the country?
Earlier we were talking about I was talking to you about vegetables as an example and types to grow. Now I've got friends that will tell you that you can't buy a decent pork chop in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And I understand if you've ever had a pork chop out of a heritage breed hog that has more marbling, more flavor. The reason you can't buy diesel in the grocery store is because the mega corporations, the integrators, have taken over the market, and they're raising pigs that are based on their idea of quality is how fast will it grow and how efficient is a feed efficiency. It has nothing to do with the end product, and they don't have to worry about somebody deciding to buy something else because there is nothing else. So we have, again, if you want to talk about what could be done to help farmers, we need to do exactly what I think you guys are talking about and start enforcing some anti-monopoly laws and start breaking some of
Yeah.
these corporations down
And I
and
think the
making
way you're
them more
saying it,
competitive.
it's not just about helping farmers, but helping all of us who eat,
Oh,
which I think
absolutely.
is most of us,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
helping us in terms of we'll get better food, we'll get healthier food, and it'll be to our benefit in the long run.
well, it's a basic thing. I mean, the two of you are as invested in farming as I am in a lot of ways
Yeah.
because you eat and you have
Yeah.
families that you want to feed and you don't want to see anybody starving.
Yeah.
Farming is an industry that, unlike almost any other in the country, that every single living person depends on.
Yeah.
And you know, I think we've made some very poor choices based on very few people making a lot of money. And
Yeah.
so, from my perspective, long term, um, I just feel like we need to not overlook the fact that we need I don't know how you say the minimum number of farmers that we need to have in the country. You know, Are we going to continue to expand to the point that you've got one farmer per county, one farmer per state? I mean, you could go to the absurd and say that, but it's almost when I started farming, I remember my local fertilizer guy dealer telling me that he had almost 300 active accounts, farmers that were full-time farmers that made a living. Several years ago, he said he was down to 17.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of consolidation.
We're nearing a single point of failure,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, we're going to, and so the tipping point is going to be when we have one of those diseases that comes through. I
Yeah.
mean, we may be in the middle of it. The avian flu, what are we going to do if it continues to wipe out the poultry operation? And it's having, my understanding is cows can get it. It just doesn't kill them, but it makes them sick and they don't produce milk as
Right.
well. They don't grow as well. It's just like you and I having the flu. You don't feel like doing anything. It's, we have everything so tension that's so strung out that almost anything could come out there
Yeah.
and throw a monkey wrench in the middle of it, and we could jam it all up. And when you think about our history, we have 50 years of history, say, and compared to mankind's time on this earth, that's a blink. Well, maybe more than a blink for mankind, but certainly in the history of the earth. We don't have a lot of experience and long-term stuff to say, make proclamations. I'm good on telling stories. So several years ago, a good friend of mine in North Carolina Farm Bureau retired, and I went to his retirement. This is after I was very active. And he had a retirement dinner, and there were a lot of people there. And I happened to hear a guy who was the swine specialist at NC State talking. And I think he was talking to somebody from NCDA and overheard the conversation. And there was a big swine disease. China lost about half of their swine
Yeah, I remember that.
population several years ago. And he was saying that he had talked to a counterpart of his in China, that they had gone out to somewhere in the central China where there's just nobody. They have lots of land there that's just completely barren or unpopulated. And they built this big swine operation trying to get it away from everything else and built it like a military installation. And there wasn't another pig within a couple hundred miles. There weren't almost anybody living there. And you had to come in and go through the whole checkpoints and do a complete shower to work in there. They had a number of thousands of hogs they were trying to breed up. Anyway, with all that safety precautions, that damn swine flu got in there and wiped out that entire facility. So I think mankind in general, and in agriculture in particular, we have a lot of hubris. Farmers and farming systems love to think we can bend Mother Nature to our will. And Mother Nature, after a while, throws its middle finger up at you. And, that's the way I've changed my farming operations, to try to look at ways of working in conjunction with Mother Nature. And that's what the whole regenerative agriculture movement is about. And there are more and more people in the country, more and more growers, primarily smaller ones, who are recognizing this and trying to move in that direction. That this wasn't a movement, say, 20 years ago.
I guess to finish, I have one more question, Avian. Have you experienced raising like hen laying or egg laying hens?
I've had a few in a pen. I mean, just the family, so they're raised commercially.
Okay, so because I'm told it's hard to get those kinds of hens at this point, but
The demand for them is really hard because of the shortage of eggs and the shortage of everything.
right.
Yeah.
But if you want some, I'm pretty sure I could hook you up, Matt. I've got customers who can take care. But that's our single largest feed that we make is layer feed.
Well, that my wife might see that as romantic because it's hard to get eggs now. Yes.
Yeah.
Everyone's telling me
Good for
about it.
Valentine's Day.
You'd be surprised at how good you don't really get really fresh eggs out of a grocery store.
We do it, and they're up to $6 a half dozen in our farmers market, and $12 a dozen. But that's what you got to pay for it at this point.
Well, I know you have a time schedule here, but I have another story to tell you that kind of speaks for that.
Okay.
A number of years ago, I was growing produce and I was selling through a farm up in Virginia, and I won't name the name of the farm, but they were dealers also. So I sold through them, and they raised a lot of sweet corn. And they went, and my son and I went up there back in probably about 10 years ago to see their operation. They had like 3,000 acres of produce. And the patriarch, the owner of the whole thing, he showed me when they were picking sweet corn how they had a whole crew that went out there and they had Hispanic labor and they were literally picking it, putting it on this truck and packing it in the boxes and putting it on the refrigerated truck. And so from the time a laborer picked the ear of sweet corn to the time it was in the box in the refrigerated truck was like a minute or two.
Mm.
And then that truck left and went to a Walmart distribution center and unloaded it. So from the time it was growing on a stalk to the time it was in the cooler at the Walmart distribution center was an hour or two.
Mm.
And then he said, you know how long it takes before Walmart puts it out for the consumer? It's like 2 weeks.
Just sitting in there rotting.
Just sitting in there. Well, it's not rotting, but it's,
Not great.
You can refrigerate something, but you've got stuff in your own refrigerator. Everybody has that stuff in the refrigerator.
Sure.
It's not the same after you leave it in there a week or two. So our
That's
food
right.
supply system is, we can feed people, but I think one of the things that people don't appreciate is the enjoyment of having really good food and quality food.
Right.
And we've lost that in a big way.
Great. Well, Jeff Bender, thank you so much for being with us on Organized Money. Learned a ton. Thank you for your work and appreciate it.
Well, I could have talked another couple hours if you wanted to. So if you want to have another conversation, give me a call.
We'll do a monster one at some point.
We have a lot of topics we didn't touch on.
Okay, great.
I thought that was really great. And I like hearing from Jeff because he's found a niche to make some money and doing something useful, but it's not solving the problem, right? And that's what I always like to see is people, that you can do this, as a consumer, as an individual farmer, something you can try, but this is clearly a systemic issue. And I like to think about failure and how everything is bad. So this is a nice,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I get all of my produce from farmers markets and I talk to the farmers and I'm able to do that year round because of where I live. And I realize I'm like a minuscule part of society that's able to do that.
You don't matter is the point, right?
Yeah.
And
that's our lesson for you as a listening audience.
Right.
You don't matter.
You don't matter. I just wanted to make it clear that you, Dave, Dan, do not matter. Just has nothing to do with.
I already knew that. I tell myself that every day.
No, I mean, no. There's actually there is a cultural change, and I think political change. But one of the things that was really striking when I was, planning this episode, and when we're talking to Jeff, is the I don't have any relationship with farming, right, at all.
Yeah,
and I never have. And then I learned about industrial agriculture. And now I have a young kid, and we like sing the song "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," right? And there's a lot of like animal stuff around kids because kids love animals, right? It's just so we sing the song "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," and you talk about you sing the different things that are on the farm, and that is just not how farms work today, right? That's kind of like our impression of
farms. A very short song.
Pigs. Right. And on that farm,
and on this farm, they had a bunch of soybeans that they sold into commodity markets.
And on that farm was a tractor you can't fix from John Deere using Ukrainian. You need to use Ukrainian software.
So it's a very different song, and it's boring. It's not a good song for people.
It's a very weird song. The damn Gen Z, whatever. Anyway, it's just really weird, like because it is actually baked into our culture. That is an old song, and that is a song that every kid knows, but it paints a picture of a world that doesn't exist anymore.
I think it speaks to that disconnect that we were talking about in the interview between everyday people who are invested in our food system in major ways because it sustains life, and the very small group of people that actually are charged with producing. And that disconnect has created the situation that we have today and created this real kind of risk, this hidden risk that's within our farm system.
Yeah. So I'm sure that the coming years it will get fixed. We're going to make America great.
There's no
Address the
question.
farm system. I'm sure they're on it. No, I mean, a bunch of farmers. I mean, I tried to push Jeff on farm politics because I know a lot of farmers are really excited about Trump, right? And I'm kind of asking them, hey, are things going? The ones I know.
Right.
Don't worry, it's through Twitter. I don't have any relationship with a farm. It's just so you can relax. I'm not in real life. But I asked them, like, have you seen anything good yet? Like, what are you noticing? And they're like, we're not sure. We don't really see anything. So, but there is a lot of excitement. I mean, this was the base of the Trump world, was rural America. So
Right.
we'll see. I mean, there are reasons to think that this might, that might change. But there are also reasons to think that it won't. But I thought that what Jeff was saying was really useful in terms of understanding like how farming works, how farmers think, and
Yeah,
where we are.
absolutely. Well, I thought it was a great episode, and we'll be back with another one for you next week on Organized Money.
Organized money.